When an avoidant actually wants you in their life, they don't tell you directly, send you clear signals, or communicate their interest through straightforward behavior that makes sense to secure or anxious attachment styles. Instead, they put you through a series of unconscious psychological tests designed to determine whether you're safe enough to keep around, strong enough to handle their patterns, and secure enough not to trigger the very attachment fears that make them test you in the first place. Understanding these tests is crucial because failing them pushes them away, while passing them creates the foundation for deeper connection with someone whose nervous system requires proof before permitting vulnerability. Their testing isn't malicious manipulation or conscious game playing. It's their trauma-damaged attachment system's way of gathering safety data before allowing emotional investment to deepen. Every test is a question their nervous system desperately needs answered. Will you abandon me when I'm difficult? Can you handle my need for space without making it about you? Will you use my vulnerability against me? Are you consistent enough to trust? Each test serves their psychological need to predict relationship safety before risking the deeper attachment that terrifies them. The cruel paradox is that these tests often look identical to disinterest, rejection, or mixed signals that suggest they're not actually invested in the connection. Their testing behavior, the withdrawal, the inconsistency, the emotional unavailability, reads as lack of care, when it's actually evidence of how much they care and how terrified they are of that caring destroying them. They push you away to see if you'll come back, create distance to measure your respect for their autonomy, and withhold emotional availability to verify you won't become dependent on their validation. Understanding their tests doesn't mean accepting poor treatment, accommodating their dysfunction indefinitely, or losing yourself while trying to prove you're safe. It means recognizing the difference between someone testing whether you can handle their attachment patterns versus someone who simply doesn't value you enough to work on those patterns. The tests reveal their interest, but your responses must balance compassion for their trauma with respect for your own needs and boundaries. The biggest risk of their testing is mistaking it for lack of interest and walking away from someone who actually wants you, or alternatively, mistaking genuine disinterest for testing and staying with someone who's using your patience as convenience rather than working toward genuine connection. The key is learning to read the difference between tests that come from fear of losing you versus behavior that comes from not caring whether they lose you at all. The emotional availability test, checking if you're safe. The avoidance most fundamental test involves measuring your reaction to their emotional withdrawal and unavailability, gathering crucial data about whether you'll respond to their natural coping mechanisms with understanding and space or with anxiety and demands that confirm their fear that relationships equal suffocation. This test begins early in the connection and continues throughout, as they repeatedly pull back emotionally to see if you'll respect their process or trigger their flight response through pursuit and emotional pressure. Their testing pattern involves them becoming suddenly less communicative, less emotionally present, or less available after periods of closeness and connection, creating deliberate distance that serves as a laboratory for observing your response. They're watching carefully to see if you'll panic when they need space, bombard them with anxious messages demanding explanation, or take their withdrawal personally and create drama that confirms relationships are overwhelming emotional minefields requiring constant management. The safe response they're hoping to see involves you maintaining your own emotional stability when they pull back, giving them the space they need without making it about your insecurity or their inadequacy, and trusting that their withdrawal is about their process rather than your worth. When you respond to their distance with calm understanding, continuing your own life, maintaining friendly but not desperate energy, and avoiding interrogation about their emotional state, you pass the test by proving you can handle their natural rhythm without adding pressure. Watch how they observe your behavior during their withdrawal periods with the intensity of scientists monitoring critical experiments. They notice whether you respect their space or violate it with constant check-ins. They track whether you remain confident in the connection or spiral into anxiety about the relationship ending. They measure whether you can self-soothe during their absence or require their presence to maintain your emotional equilibrium. The emotional availability test extends to how you handle their inability to provide consistent emotional support or deep emotional engagement, particularly during early relationship stages when their defenses are still firmly in place. They're assessing whether you can find emotional regulation through your own resources and support systems, or whether you'll demand they provide emotional labor they're not yet capable of offering without overwhelming their nervous system. Their testing includes them sharing superficial information while withholding deeper emotional content, measuring whether you'll pressure them to open up faster than feels safe or respect their pace of emotional disclosure. When you respond with interest in what they do, share, without demanding access to what they're not ready to reveal, you demonstrate the patience and respect for their boundaries that makes deeper sharing feel possible rather than dangerous. The test intensifies after moments of genuine intimacy or vulnerability, as they predictably withdraw to see if the closeness scared you away, made you clingy and dependent, or if you can handle the natural ebb and flow of connection with someone whose nervous system requires regular distance to process intimacy. Your ability to remain steady through these post-intimacy withdrawals proves you understand their patterns rather than taking them as personal rejection. Their emotional availability test often includes them being present physically while being absent emotionally, checking if you can appreciate their physical presence without demanding the emotional availability they're not prepared to provide in that moment. When you can enjoy their company without requiring constant emotional engagement or deep conversation, you pass the test by showing you value them beyond their emotional output. The testing mechanism includes them observing how you manage your own emotions and whether you require their participation in your emotional regulation. They need to know that your emotional well-being doesn't depend on their constant availability, that you have resources for managing difficult feelings independently, and that loving them won't require them to become responsible for your emotional state in ways that feel burdensome and overwhelming. Their assessment extends to whether you can differentiate between their need for space and their feelings about you, understanding that their withdrawal is about managing their own nervous system rather than communication about your value or the relationship's future. When you demonstrate this sophisticated emotional intelligence, giving space without assuming abandonment, you prove you can handle their attachment style without making it a constant source of relationship conflict. The most crucial aspect of this test is whether you can maintain your own emotional independence and security while remaining open and available for connection when they're ready to re-engage. They need partners who can be warm and present without being needy, available without being demanding, and interested without being desperate, a balance that demonstrates both strength and flexibility. The boundary test, pushing to see what you'll accept. The avoidance boundary testing involves them deliberately pushing against your limits with inconsistent behavior, last-minute cancellations, or mild disrespect to discover where your actual boundaries lie and whether you'll enforce them with calm confidence or accept poor treatment while resenting them silently. This isn't about them wanting to mistreat you. It's about their deep psychological need to understand the structure and limits of the relationship before feeling safe to invest more deeply in connection that requires vulnerability. Their testing pattern includes behaviors like canceling plans without much notice, being vague about their availability, showing up late without apology, or maintaining connections with exes or potential romantic interests that create ambiguity about their commitment level. They're watching intensely to see whether you'll communicate clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept, or whether you'll accommodate their behavior while building resentment that eventually explodes in ways that confirm relationships are emotionally chaotic and unpredictable. The response they're hoping for, though they might not consciously realize it, involves you calmly and clearly stating your boundaries without anger, drama, or attempts to control their behavior. When you say something like, "I need you to give me at least 24 hours notice if you need to cancel plans, or I'll make other arrangements," without emotional manipulation or punishment, you pass the test by showing you have standards you'll enforce while respecting their autonomy to make their own choices within those parameters. Watch how they respond when you actually enforce boundaries rather than just stating them. This reveals whether they were testing to find your limits or simply looking for someone who will accept poor treatment indefinitely. An avoidant who genuinely wants you in their life will typically respect clearly communicated boundaries and may even feel more secure knowing where the lines are, while someone using testing as manipulation will escalate their boundary violations when you attempt to enforce standards. Their boundary testing often includes them being deliberately vague about relationship status, future plans, or their feelings to see if you'll pressure them for clarity or respect their need to move at their own pace while maintaining your own standards for what you need to feel secure. When you can hold the tension of ambiguity without forcing premature definition, while also not accepting indefinite uncertainty, you demonstrate the balance they need to feel safe, deepening the connection. The testing extends to how you respond when they prioritize other areas of their life, work, friends, hobbies. Over time with you, checking whether you'll become demanding and jealous about their attention, or whether you'll respect their need for balanced life that doesn't revolve entirely around romantic connection, your ability to support their other priorities while maintaining your own full life passes the test by proving you won't become the suffocating presence their trauma warns them relationships create. Their boundary testing frequently involves them maintaining more independence and freedom than you might expect for the relationship's intimacy level, keeping separate social circles, maintaining privacy about certain life areas, or resisting relationship rituals that feel too couple-like or enmeshed. They're assessing whether you can accept this level of separateness or whether you'll interpret it as rejection and push for more integration than their nervous system can handle. The test includes them observing how you handle their need to make independent decisions without consulting you about choices that don't directly affect you, their friendships, their schedule, their personal pursuits. When you demonstrate that you don't need to be involved in every aspect of their life and don't interpret their autonomy as exclusion, you show the respect for independence that makes them feel safe rather than trapped. Their testing often involves mild inconsistencies between their words and actions to see if you'll call them out directly or passively accept the discrepancy while becoming resentful. They might say they'll text later and not follow through, express interest in plans they don't pursue, or indicate feelings they don't demonstrate through behavior. Your response to these inconsistencies, addressing them calmly and directly rather than ignoring them or attacking them, demonstrates the communication style they need to feel safe being honest about their limitations. The boundary testing frequently includes them checking whether you have strong enough sense of self to maintain your own standards and values, rather than molding yourself to their preferences or accepting treatment that violates your own needs. They actually respect and feel safer with partners who have clear boundaries than with people pleasers who accommodate everything while building internal resentment that eventually creates the emotional chaos they fear. Their assessment extends to whether your boundaries are rigid rules designed to control their behavior or flexible standards that protect your well-being while respecting their autonomy. When you can differentiate between boundaries that serve your legitimate needs versus demands that try to change who they fundamentally are, you demonstrate the emotional maturity that makes them feel understood rather than judged. The most important aspect of their boundary testing is discovering whether you'll enforce your limits through action rather than just words, whether you'll actually follow through on consequences you state, or whether your boundaries are negotiable when they push against them. When you demonstrate that your boundaries are real through consistent enforcement without drama or punishment, you create the structure and predictability that paradoxically makes them feel safe enough to be closer rather than trapped. The independence test, seeing if you can handle their freedom. The avoidance independence test involves them deliberately maintaining significant autonomy, separate identity, and freedom in their life to determine whether you can handle their need for space and separateness without interpreting it as rejection or attempting to control their behavior to meet your need for more togetherness. This test is crucial because their attachment trauma has taught them that relationships equal loss of self, and they need proof that loving you won't require sacrificing the independence that feels essential to their psychological survival. Their testing pattern includes them making plans without you, maintaining active separate social life, pursuing individual interests with intensity that might seem to exclude you, and generally living as though they're single in many aspects while still maintaining romantic connection with you. They're observing carefully whether you can support their autonomy without feeling threatened, whether you trust them without needing constant access to their time and attention, and whether you have enough going on in your own life not to fixate on their independent activities. The safe response they're hoping to discover involves you having such a full, satisfying life of your own that their independent pursuits don't trigger anxiety or feelings of abandonment. When you respond to their plans with friends by making your own plans rather than feeling left out, when you support their hobbies and interests even when they don't include you, And when you demonstrate genuine enthusiasm for their autonomous life, rather than subtle resentment about their time away from you, you pass the test dramatically. Watch how they observe your reaction when they mention solo trips, time with friends you don't know, or activities they pursue independently without inviting you to participate. They're measuring whether you'll make these normal expressions of selfhood into relationship problems requiring negotiation and compromise, or whether you'll celebrate their full engagement with life beyond your relationship. Their independence testing includes them maintaining privacy about certain aspects of their life, not because they're hiding problematic behavior, but because they need to know they can have thoughts, experiences, and dimensions of self that aren't automatically shared with or accessible to you. When you respect this privacy without interpreting it as secrecy or evidence of dishonesty, you demonstrate trust that makes them feel safe rather than surveilled. The test extends to whether you require constant updates about their whereabouts, activities, and thoughts, or whether you can tolerate significant periods where you don't know exactly what they're doing without anxiety spiraling into interrogation or accusations. Your ability to give them freedom without needing real-time accountability proves you trust them and yourself enough to handle the uncertainty that healthy autonomy creates. Their testing frequently involves them spending time pursuing goals, interests, or relationships that have nothing to do with you, career advancement that requires long hours, friendships that predate you and don't naturally include you, hobbies that consume their focus and energy. They need to know that your sense of security in the relationship doesn't depend on being central to every aspect of their life or being prioritized above all other meaningful pursuits and connections. The independence test includes them observing whether you have your own strong sense of identity, interests, and social connections, or whether you're looking to them to provide meaning, purpose, and social engagement that should come from multiple sources. When you demonstrate you're a whole person with a full life independent of them, you pass the test by showing the relationship will be addition rather than substitution for the life you've already built. Their assessment extends to how you handle their need for alone time. Not just physical solitude, but emotional space where they can process their own thoughts and feelings without your input or participation. When you can respect their need for this internal privacy without taking it personally or demanding access to their every thought and feeling, you show the emotional sophistication that makes vulnerability feel possible rather than invasive. The testing mechanism includes them checking whether you become controlling, jealous, or demanding when they exercise their freedom, or whether you maintain confidence in the relationship while supporting their autonomous self-expression. They're observing whether your security comes from their constant presence and attention or from internal sources that remain stable, regardless of how they spend their time. Their independence test often involves them maintaining somewhat separate lives even as the relationship deepens, keeping their own place longer than might seem normal, resisting moving in together or combining lives in traditional ways, maintaining distinct friend groups and social spheres. They need to know you can handle this slower pace of integration and non-traditional approach to relationship building without interpreting it as lack of commitment or pushing for faster merging than their nervous system can tolerate. The most revealing aspect of this test is whether you celebrate their independence as a sign of healthy selfhood or resent it as evidence they're not sufficiently invested in the relationship. When you genuinely support their autonomy, encourage their independent pursuits, and demonstrate you're attracted to their full, complex, separate self, rather than threatened by it, you create the psychological safety that paradoxically allows them to choose more closeness rather than feeling forced into it. The patience test, measuring your tolerance for their process. The avoidance patience test involves them moving through relationship milestones, emotional developments, and commitment stages at a pace that feels glacially slow to secure or anxious attachment styles. Carefully observing whether you can handle their timeline without pressure, ultimatums, or resentment that confirms their fear that relationships require sacrificing their need for time and space to process intimacy. This test is perhaps their most crucial because their entire attachment system depends on having control over the pace of vulnerability and commitment that feels safe to their trauma-wired nervous system. Their testing pattern includes them taking significantly longer than you might expect to define the relationship, introduce you to important people in their life, say, "I love you," or make future commitments that suggest permanence and deeper emotional investment. They're measuring whether you can appreciate and participate in the present connection without constantly pushing for the next stage, whether you trust the process of natural development without forcing premature advancement, and whether you have enough patience to let them arrive at relationship milestones on their own timeline rather than yours. The response they're hoping for involves you demonstrating genuine comfort with slow relationship development, celebrating small steps forward rather than fixating on what hasn't happened yet, and showing through your behavior that you're building something solid rather than racing toward predetermined relationship checkpoints. When you respond to their slow pace with patience that comes from genuine security rather than strategic self-control, you pass the test by proving that being with you doesn't require them to move faster than feel safe. Watch how they observe your reactions when they don't reciprocate emotional expressions as quickly as you offer them, when they need more time before relationship transitions that seem natural or overdue to you, or when they appear to be holding back in ways that might frustrate someone less patient. They're assessing whether you'll respect their process or whether you'll interpret their slower pace as lack of interest and create pressure that triggers their flight response. Their patience testing includes them occasionally moving backward after steps forward, becoming more distant after periods of closeness, needing more space after vulnerable sharing, or appearing to retreat from relationship progress that seemed established. They need to know that you can handle this nonlinear development without panicking, without assuming the relationship is failing, and without demanding they maintain constant forward momentum that overwhelms their nervous system's capacity to process increasing intimacy. The test extends to whether you can hold the uncertainty and ambiguity of relationships that develop slowly without clear definition, without constant reassurance about where things are heading, and without the traditional markers and timelines that make many people feel secure. When you demonstrate that you can be present in the relationship as it actually exists, rather than constantly worried about what it should become, you show the emotional maturity that makes them feel safe rather than pressured. Their testing frequently involves them needing extended time to process emotional experiences, relationship conflicts, or important decisions before they can respond or engage authentically. They might need days or weeks to process a difficult conversation before being ready to revisit it, or months to consider relationship transitions that others might decide quickly. Your ability to give them this processing time without interpreting it as avoidance or disinterest proves you understand their psychological needs. The patience test includes them observing whether you can tolerate not knowing exactly where you stand or where the relationship is going while still choosing to participate in the connection that exists right now. When you can live with appropriate uncertainty without constantly seeking definition, labels, or future guarantees, you demonstrate trust in the organic unfolding of relationship development that their nervous system requires to feel safe, increasing vulnerability. Their assessment extends to how you handle their need for time alone or away from the relationship to maintain their sense of self and process their feelings about increasing closeness. They might need regular periods of reduced contact or decreased relationship focus to integrate their growing attachment without feeling overwhelmed. When you respect these rhythms without taking them personally or demanding constant relationship intensity, you show understanding of their process. The testing mechanism includes them checking whether you have enough going on in your own life, that their slow pace doesn't leave you feeling stuck or frustrated, while waiting for them to catch up to your readiness for deeper commitment. When you're actively building your own life, pursuing your goals, and maintaining fulfillment that doesn't depend on relationship status progression, you pass the test by proving their timeline doesn't control your happiness or sense of life direction. Their patience test often involves them being vague or non-committal about future plans, not because they don't envision a future with you, but because committing to that future before they feel ready triggers their attachment fears. They need to know you can handle this present-focused approach without constantly pushing for future guarantees that feel like premature obligation rather than natural evolution of deepening connection. The most crucial aspect of this test is whether your patience comes from genuine security and trust in the relationship's organic development, or from strategic control of your true feelings to avoid scaring them away. They can sense the difference between authentic patience that respects their process and performative patience that's building resentment beneath surface calm. When your patience is real, coming from your own security rather than fear of losing them, You create the safety that actually allows them to move forward, rather than stay perpetually stuck.